Well, thank you for everybody being here with us today. This exhibit is really, if you've not had the chance to go through yet, we really look forward to you being able to experience it and to be able to tell us what you think about it. And we are really proud that this is here in Peoria, Illinois. And that really is because of the man that I have sitting right here. And Seth, over the past couple of years, you have been coming into Peoria to be able to work with our curators, to be able to meet the people of Peoria, and to really get to know our museum and our vision. And I think probably the first question we ought to start with is why you chose, because this year is a very big year with the 250 across the country, why you chose to partner with the Peoria Riverfront Museum as a guest curator.
Well, it comes down to one. I guess I should do this. Is that? There we go. Comes down to one word. You guys said yes, and I had wanted to do a big exhibit. This starts years ago, thinking, well, 2026 is coming up. I hope this is not a wasted opportunity. We really need in this country sources of agreement, shared principles, shared ideas, shared aspirations, and many of our founding documents can give us that. And I really wanted us not to focus on just history. I mean, I'll admit this. I too sometimes think when I hear the word history, boring. And how do we make it not boring? And what are we going to do with the Declaration of Independence to make people understand that it's still relevant? And so I had this idea that became the Promise of Liberty. And through Mark Schenkman, our mutual friend, a good client of mine, a good collector who brought his flags here, he introduced me to John Morris. And when we were in colonial Williamsburg, and I was looking for partners to host the Promise of Liberty, the best response came from John and Bill and then the whole team who came back the next year, taking on this great project.
So the lesson there is, I guess, if we always ask and you always say yes, this partnership has got a long future. And John mentions that you are, and this is true, the foremost authority on the Declaration of Independence. And over the years, and maybe because of the schoolhouse rock that some of us grew up on, or the little plates that are in some very bad history books that we had young, we kind of think of, or we have these ideas of the Declaration of Independence and that big, gigantic signature. So can you talk a little bit about that? Is there one copy of the Declaration of Independence? And if there are more, how do you authenticate them?
Sure. Well, there's almost an unlimited number of copies of the Declaration of Independence. But what is an original? What is the original? So when people say the Declaration, they flash on National Treasure, the handwritten document signed by those 56 guys. But the fact that there's more than one original, and I can say that the original copy on display is actually, in a way, more original than that National Treasure. What do I mean? Well, that was created a month after the fact, really as a souvenir for posterity. What really happened, July 2nd, Congress votes for independence, declare independence. Takes 2 days more to agree on the text of the Declaration of Independence, which came after the resolution. The Declaration is the greatest press release in history and the greatest separation note in history. But none of it matters if the word doesn't get out. And so, we don't have the internet, TV, phones. How does the word get out? Well, thanks to Mr. Gutenberg, a few hundred years before, there's this thing called the printing press, and that's the most efficient way for information to get out. What you're looking at is one of the rare broadside printings of the Declaration. It is just as original as the July 4th printing in Philadelphia, and to show that there is actually more than one original. So this is the one that I've been planning on having in the exhibit, and then about 3 weeks ago, something came up, and that particular copy was not available. And luckily, we got our hands on another one. So the one on display in the gallery is printed in Salem, Massachusetts, in 4 columns, and has all of the text, and is an original that somebody could have seen. And what makes a broadside, it's a single printed page with all of the text on one side. So you could read it, but then you could post it for everybody else in your town to read. And that's why that format is so important, so original, and it was meant to be ephemeral. It accomplished its purpose of spreading the news. People read it, knew we had declared independence. There wasn't a market for collectibles back then. These things didn't have any value. And so after they were used, most of them were discarded, and that's what accounts for the great rarity today.
Very interesting. How do you authenticate? If you see some of these coming forward, is there a way that helps you authenticate which of those might be some of those original documents and which ones were maybe some printed in the later months? Or
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of different types of declarations that get authenticated differently. But the broadsides, you look at the ink and the paper and the feel of it. And every week I get people, emailing me or calling me about copies of the Declaration of Independence. There are some really good replicas that were made actually in Chicago in the 1940s that people see and think of as originals. The easiest ones to disauthenticate are the ones on this very brittle parchment paper. And the broadsides are all on paper. The facsimiles that show the signatures, those are all on parchment, which is animal skin, but parchment paper means museum store replica. And we ask, because I have to authenticate these things over the phone a lot too, or by email, just to tell people not to spend a lot of time and money authenticating something. It's like the size actually is a great indication. If it's not the size of the original, it's not an original.
as a kid during the bicentennial, I remember my parents giving me this envelope of documents that were printed on these papers that seemed like they were very old, and I, for a while, thought I had the original Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
So luckily, I did not bring that to you for authentication.
I'm going to just, one thing. At a symposium on the Declaration at the National Archives, it's funny, most museums don't like to talk about value, but somebody in the audience asked me about, what is the most valuable copy of the Declaration of Independence? And just the night before, a client of mine had told me about one of these museum store copies that he gave to his grandchild, and his grandchild's reaction to it. And I said, that's probably the most valuable copy of the Declaration, that or any one of millions of others. It's the one that somebody's going to read and be inspired by.
I still have it.
Yeah.
John mentions, and it is very true, that you are the leading expert in the country on documents. How did you become that? That's not something that I think automatically happens. Yeah. Was that study? Was that interest? Can you walk us down that path a little bit about what brought you into that realm? Yeah,
well, I was an indentured servant, basically, in my family's business in rare stamps and coins. So I was very good at it and bored the heck out of me. And it wasn't until about a month before I was graduating from college when I realized, my project that's kept me doing this for 10 years, it's over in a month. I can go get a career, get a life, go to law school. I missed the deadline for the LSAT because I hadn't thought of this. And I thought, well, what can I do for a year that I would enjoy? And because of the stamp and coin business, I knew how auctions worked. I knew how dealers worked. I was familiar with the need for authentication and stuff like that. I figured, let me play with historic documents. I'll do that for a year, and then I'll go to law school. But what happened is, on my birthday in 1989, my first year out of college, my very first meeting with a prospective client for historic documents was a man named Lou Lehrman. And in that meeting, which came about by chance, we'd sent a cold call letter to somebody else, and it got handed to Lou. So I sat down with Lou, showed him some of the documents that I had bought, and said, I'd like to collect for you. And Lou gave me a chance. And that meeting resulted in him eventually bringing Dick Gilder in to partner. At the time, there were no documents on the internet. There was no Library of Congress and Smithsonian with millions of documents. And they immediately realized we could acquire these documents, bring them into one place, the Gilder Lehrman Institute, and use them to help change the way history is taught by introducing original historic documents. And the Gilder Lehrman Institute, so I made the first 68,000 acquisitions, which makes it not even close to the top 10 biggest collections, but item for item in terms of the highlights, we can match any other institution in the world. And last year, 450,000 students used just the Alexander Hamilton documents I bought for them in partnership with the show Hamilton, every USAP history student. So that one client and collection is what within 6 months after I started doing this, Lou said, Seth, you're not going to law school. And I said, okay, this is interesting. This is more interesting. And about a year into it, we were the largest in the field. And by being able to buy all these great things for the Gilder Lehrman Institute, then I would be the person who keeps getting offered or called on for copies of the Declaration and the Constitution. And so, learn by doing.
You helped Gilder Lehrman really build one of the foremost collections. And the one thing that I've often heard you talk with them is about access. And can you just talk a little bit about why access to documents is important?
Yeah, and I'll start by a question you didn't really ask, but think about the Mona Lisa. Millions of people a year will stand online and go into this museum to see the original Mona Lisa. There's nobody in this room or this state, or maybe 3 people in the country, who could tell the difference between the Mona Lisa and a really great replica of it. But a museum has to be honest and say what's a replica. Nobody's standing in line to see the replica. So there is some aura about the authenticity of it. So you could educate with the Declaration of Independence. You don't need a Declaration of Independence. But there is some connection to it that gives you more gravitas, that people pay attention to it. So by owning these documents, people took the Gilder Lehrman Institute as a more serious source. And the really interesting thing is that that aura transfers online. It's not just that you're in the room, but when you're talking about the Declaration and they know that you're the institute that has it, that gives you more say, more gravitas. People pay more attention than somebody who doesn't. And so it's that connection to the documents, the originals, the education. This firsthand, you can put your hand on the case or actually hold one of these original documents that created the world that we live in.
And Louis Lehrman has a very special connection to Peoria because while he was somebody who ran for governor in New York, was a great philanthropist, he also spent, I believe, 10 years writing about Lincoln's speech in Peoria. Can you talk about the Lehrman connection to Peoria and really your path to Peoria as well? Because those things all really do have a connection, and we in Peoria are lucky because of both of those.
I would have to say it probably started in Lou's boyhood on a farm very close to Gettysburg. So when he'd be walking around in his neighborhood, he'd find artifacts of the battle. And of course, Gettysburg and Lincoln, he had great interest in Abraham Lincoln. So Peoria was just his recognition that one of the most important speeches that Lincoln gave, which is, unfortunately, the total text of it isn't known, but the importance of it is, because it was Lincoln coming back into politics. He had served one term in the United States House of Representatives by agreement. Somebody else went on, and then another. They had rotated, but he got fed up and didn't go back into politics until the Dred Scott decision. the worst, or arguably the worst decision, Supreme Court decision in American history, which went well beyond the brief. Instead of just deciding that this slave in one state who was taken into a free state was still a slave, they wrote, there's no right, the black man has no right that a white man is bound to respect. And that was fundamentally against Lincoln's idea of America. This idea of freedom, even understanding that we have slavery, that we're not perfect, it wasn't meant to be perpetual. Most of the founders actually thought that slavery would die out much sooner than it did. One of the artifacts in the exhibition is one of the reasons why it didn't, the cotton gin, which changed the world and made slavery more economic again. It went from something that the founders thought would die off on its own to something that was expanding. And that bothered Lincoln tremendously. And then with Dred Scott and popular sovereignty also of Stephen Douglas, thinking, well, slavery maybe won't be extinct on its own. In fact, here are all these people who are trying to make it national. And so he got back into politics, and Peoria was one of the first places where he came to actually fight head-to-head, really, with Stephen Douglas, and then gained more prominence back at my home in New York at the Cooper Institute, and then fought the Lincoln-Douglas debates. But anyway, sorry, Gettysburg, Peoria, okay. Lou researched Peoria, wrote a great book on Lincoln at Peoria, and so I was very fond of this place. And then there are other connections also that immediately made Peoria sort of a really interesting place to do this.
Well, and there's going to be in the exhibition, there's a very special photograph, tintype, that people definitely need to maybe take a look at. But I also heard you tell a story about, we know Lincoln is a great orator, is a great lawyer, but also he's a great strategist. And you talk about that he made sure that, in a way, he got on record a certain question or a certain dialogue with Douglas, which probably helped in the overall picture of Lincoln being able to ascend to president because of the playing field, everybody knowing certain things that were out there. So can you fill us in on that?
Sure. Right there in the exhibit is a first edition of Lincoln's signed Lincoln-Douglas debates. A challenge of museum exhibits is, we can't write everything, and so we argued about this and have a lot in the text of the exhibit labels, but there's so much that we can't get to. In that book is Lincoln's debate with Douglas in Freeport, and he knowingly set up what he called the Freeport question, which Lincoln wrote before he did it. This is going to cost me the election to the Senate, but I'm going to do this because if Douglas takes the bait, and Lincoln says, and I know he will, he can never be president. And Lincoln was worried about Douglas because he might have been the one person who could have been elected as a Democrat nationally. And on the heels of the Dred Scott decision, that would really been the death knell of America as a country based on liberty. And so he did that. He strategically, threw himself under the bus in Illinois. But then there's an ancient Greek or Roman phrase, the seeds of discord or the apple of discord, where you throw it into the room and all the fights start. He used that to throw the apple of discord into the Democratic Party. And instead of Douglas being the one Democratic candidate, there were 3 Democratic candidates. And that's how Lincoln won without a single electoral vote in the South.
And because of Louis Lerman, we've got a book that I think is really important for Peorians to read. And we talk about pride of place, and this really does, I think, set the stage of history right here and us knowing what really happened right here, not far, less than a block from here almost. And whether it's Louis Lerman, Gilder, you've been able to work with some of the top collectors of national heritage pieces throughout the country. Do you see, when you're thinking about those collectors, that there are some common traits that they share? And then could you also maybe walk us through some of those collectors or the pieces that are in the exhibition, which we ought to really kind of make sure we pay a little extra attention to, because these are very special?
Yeah, that is a tough one. The second part. So the first part, traits that my clients tend to share, because there are all sorts of collectors. Some are very, this is mine, I want it. A lot of my clients are motivated by supporting education. A lot of mine, David Rubenstein invented the phrase patriotic philanthropy, which I think fits very well, and Lou Lehrman and Dick Hilder were definitely doing that kind of patriotic philanthropy. They were inspired by the ideas of the founding and of Lincoln, who is inspired by the ideas of the founding. They're thinking that America, despite its flaws, can be the greatest country in the world based on the ideas and the aspirations and the hopes of those who came before us. And very successful people have wanted to share that success and that inspiration with others. So they've collected these documents. Some, like Gilder Lehrman, of the 68,000 documents that I bought for them, I think there were maybe 15 that they ever had in their home for temporary time. Most of them went right into what became the collection archive. It's now at New York Historical Society. Other collectors, the Thanksgiving Proclamation was bought by a collector about 11 years ago, and he's never had it in his home or office. It's just he bought it because he understands how important it is. He feels a great connection to it, and he leaves it with me to find appropriate places to show it.
Well, thank you for choosing Peoria as one of those places to be able to show this. When we talk about the U.S. Constitution, you often talk about it as sort of a mission statement that we can work under. And you have, and I have to admit, that when you first threw this phrase out, the first time we met, that it was really technology, and that it's an operating system for us to sort of embrace and be able to use. I was a little skeptical of those terms, because to me, how could a piece of paper be technology? And over the years, being able to have you explain your perspective on that, and being able to understand not only that the document was never intended to not change, it was intended from its start to be a living, breathing document. I have come to your philosophy on both those points. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Great, thanks. I should just repeat whatever I said before, if I could. There's this idea called originalism today that basically says that we have to interpret the Constitution by putting ourselves in the shoes and the wigs of the men who lived almost 250 years ago, and that it wasn't meant to change. But if you read the documents, particularly the cover letter from George Washington, which talks about the situation and circumstances that they're responding to, they are, first of all, creating a government that doesn't say this is by divine right, we are perfect, and God gave us control of this country. They are the first government created with the humility of understanding that people are flawed, and therefore governments are flawed. And so the most important thing in it is the checks and balances. And the idea that right in there, we can amend it. The first government created with the idea not only is it flawed, but we're going to have to change it. And so that's there. But what makes it technology is the definition goes beyond gadgets. It's also systems of applying knowledge to solve problems. And that's what this document is. That's what democracy is. It's we create the input by elections, part of the technology. We have this operating system even though it was written almost 200, the semi-sesquicentennial is Declaration of Independence. And why are we talking a lot about the Constitution? Well, the Declaration created the inspiration, the aspiration, the idea of liberty, the words that created the nation. But even in John Hancock's cover letter, he said this will be the ground and foundation of a future government. So the idea of America starts in 1776. The actual government of the United States of America starts with the Constitution, inspired by the Declaration. So I think it's appropriate to celebrate the Declaration and the Constitution that actually created the government founded by the Declaration.
Very much agreed. And you touched on it just a minute there, but Washington's pre-letter to it that really goes into why this is important. Can you just spend a little bit more time on that? Because that is something that is often left out of every little handbook of Constitution and not really even taught in a lot of government classes. So that's an important document as well that should be always attached with the Constitution.
Yeah, well, there's a little bit of politics in there first. Everybody has this idea of the Constitutional Convention. Philadelphia did write the Constitution, but they have no power at all. They don't even officially report to the states. Their individual delegates report to their states, but the only party that the Constitutional Convention reports to is Congress, which happens to be in New York. And the Constitution gets written, it's being signed, it's going out by stagecoach, 10 a.m. the next day, and they realize, wait a sec, we just spent months in Philadelphia in the summer, no air conditioning, this wasn't a pleasant thing. We don't want our work to all get lost. And they realize, hey, if this happens, everybody is going to see something in the Constitution that they really don't like. And they're not going to have all the background on what went into the compromises that caused everybody to coalesce and agree. And so they said, before we send it, let's quickly write these cover letters. The first one is the one that said to Congress, don't do what you think you're going to do and make a decision for the country. Send it out to the states and let the people of each state decide whether this government is going to be ratified, whether this will be our government. Sort of putting Congress out of business, this Congress anyway. The second letter is the one that I really love and is the most fascinating, important, forgotten founding document. Tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of copies of the pocket constitutions are given out. And it doesn't have this letter, which is cover letter. It's signed by George Washington, but approved by the entire Continental Congress. And it says things like, in order to preserve liberty, you have to give up a share of liberty. And the hardest thing the government does is deciding which liberties must be surrendered in order to preserve the more important liberties. And what is the more important liberty? That may depend on where you live. That depends on the situation and circumstances. In the North, it's fisheries and economic life. In the West, it might be Native Americans. In the South, it's the Spanish that they're worried about at that time. But he uses the phrase that the situation and circumstances, and because of everything going on, they were more amenable to compromise. As long as every area got the most important thing for their safety and security, they had to give up other things to make sure that the other areas could say the same. And so when you read this and there's something about this that you don't like, keep that in mind, that if it's only me first, you're not going to get any government that protects you. And one of the fun phrases in George Washington's inaugural address, drafts that are in here, is, mankind are naturally averse to the coercions of government until they've lived in a place where there isn't sufficient government. Yes. And it's all about that the founders are creating a document that is different at that moment that would have been a year before, and they're talking about the things that change that cause these differences. But it's very clear that it's creating a living document because the situation and circumstances are always going to change, and this operating system needs to keep working anyway with amendments, but it's not going to need a lot of amendments. It's going to need basic operating system amendments, but the day-to-day is through the three branches, the co-equal branches that are meant to checks and balances and create the government that we need to create. And one of my hopes for this exhibit is to get people excited about the Constitution as technology, to get beyond all the parties are corrupt or we can't do anything. It's really to take ownership of our history, both the promise of liberty, the downsides of that, where our liberty can sometimes come at the expense of other people's liberties, and we have to be aware of that, and we have to be able to compromise. But this is stuff that we can use to take control of our government and of our lives, and to the extent that it's broken, we have the tools right in there to fix it.
Well said. And I think that's one of the important things as you walk through the exhibition is it really does show, and to go along with your idea of operating system, that those updates that happen really do keep everything up to date and important and pertinent, and it is as viable a document today as it was when it was written originally. We talk about the Constitution a lot. We talk about the Declaration of Independence. We're exposed to those documents. We're exposed, a lot to the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech. In this exhibition, there are also some documents which may be lesser known, but also hold significance in their own right. And I'd like to be able to talk about a couple of these and have you explain or just give us a little bit better insight into some of these. And the first one would be Washington's "No Bigotry, No Sanction" letter.
Yeah. When he traveled, he did a little goodwill tour of the Northeast as he became president. And when he traveled to different places, he'd get addresses from the governments, from universities. So there was one from Harvard and Yale and Princeton, the big ones that existed back then. And he had this great habit that today we might call plagiarism, but more charitably, he's taking the best stuff that's written to him and he's calling it back and expanding on it. And so in Newport, the letter that he gets from Moses Seixas on behalf of the Newport Jewish congregation, all the churches got together and gave him an address, and the Jewish congregation wasn't part of that, so they had the same opportunity to publicly speak to the president, to give their address, and then they'd also hand it to him in writing, and when he got back to the Capitol in New York, he wrote his response. So Moses Seixas used this phrase, "To bigotry, no sanction," in his letter that basically said, for thousands of years, Jews are being discriminated against politically. Here's a new government based on the idea of liberty. Are we included? And Washington doesn't just say yes, and doesn't just repeat "to bigotry, no sanction." He starts by saying, it's not enough that toleration is spoken of. The first response is, yeah, we can be tolerant, we can let you do this. Because toleration is a grant from the powerful to the less powerful. That can be revoked. He is basing his entire political philosophy, all the founders are basing their whole political philosophy on the idea of God-given or inherent natural rights above any government. And if you believe that, then the government shouldn't be in the discrimination business. So he says that, thankfully, America gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, and requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens and give it on all occasions their effectual support. Not unquestioning support, effectual support. And that idea that, we celebrated today, and he doesn't say "to bigotry no sanction except for women." He doesn't say "to bigotry no sanction except for slaves or except for black people." He says "to bigotry no sanction." And the second part of that is What are we doing? We're living in a country, we're giving it effectual support. Why is he writing this letter? It doesn't go just to the Jewish congregation, and there were 21 or 23 of these letters. So right next to it, we have his letter to the Roman Catholics, where he's talking about hoping the country becomes more liberal and including people. What he's describing in that letter is a nation based on inclusion. And if you're basing your political philosophy on inherent natural rights, yeah, in 1790, you're going to be constrained in your thoughts by what's happening in society, by what you know, what you understand. But 250 years later, when you're seeing that women actually can not only vote, but they can lead countries. Blacks can not only, earn a living, but they can lead. They can be part of the process, and we're a stronger and a better country when everybody is included. So the word that I wish they had was manifestation. What he's doing in letters like this, saying America gives to bigotry no sanction, he's not actually telling the truth. He starts by saying, America has given to the mankind these great lessons. No, this is 1790. We haven't done anything. We've given some great words, but we haven't actually done it. But he's writing it just like Jefferson is writing in the Declaration about these self-evident truths that all men are created equal. The actor Sophia Bush, who's a wonderful liberal icon and leader of the Me Too movement and was involved for a while with Black Lives Matter and all. And her friends, her liberal friends, make fun of her for loving the founding documents and this history. And they said, why? Ilana Glazer, another comedian actor, asked her why. And she said, because their words knew before they did.
Well said.
So that's why we're celebrating the words. But we're doing it in a way that it's not just putting these documents on a pedestal, but dealing also with the paradox of liberty, starting with Native Americans, just to give, Ken Burns has said that all the treaties with Native Americans that basically force them to give up their land, those are founding documents too, because you don't have a country without having land. The Abraham Lincoln is a founder of the United States, a refounder, by pushing for the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment. He was able to refound the country based on the principles of the founding. When Susan Anthony and every woman who came and every woman and man who came after finally passed the 19th Amendment, they're refounding the country, so they too are founders. Martin Luther King Jr. is a founder of the United States just as much as any man in the Constitutional Convention, because we wouldn't be the United States that we have today without MLK.
Very true. One of the other documents that's within the exhibition is Frederick Douglass's letter to Peoria, or about a visit to Peoria. And can you talk a little bit about that letter?
So I wasn't prepared to quote that letter. I know it's written.
Or just talk a little bit about maybe how that letter, because we'll be able to see the letter in the exhibition.
Yeah. So it's written in 1880. He's looking back on a visit to Peoria and how he would have been stranded without the help of Robert Ingersoll, who he called, I think, after midnight or 2 a.m. or something, and was invited with open arms into his home. One of the fun things, and we talked about collectors and all, but one of the fun things is, okay, we're doing an exhibit, and it's in Peoria, and of course Frederick Douglass has to be included. We have his greatest speech, which is, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" At the same time celebrating the ideals of America and criticizing it and putting his feet to the fire and holding us to the standard of living up to the pledges of the Declaration of Independence. But also, as I was thinking of this, I'm like, oh, Peoria, Robert Ingersoll, I know who. I bought that letter 26 years ago or so for a private collector, and I remembered it because a couple of years ago I did a proposal for a Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln exhibit, which hasn't happened yet. hint, hint. And just, hey, this is the first time we've had a chance to show that publicly, and it's just so exciting to have it here.
And I agree. And I think, again, it shows pride of place because Peorians may not be familiar with Frederick Douglass's several trips to Peoria and the importance that those played in his speeches throughout the year. FDR's Four Freedoms. Can you give us a little bit of your insight on the letter from FDR concerning the Four Freedoms?
Yeah, it's actually his State of the Union address. And on page 7, if you go into the gallery, it's listing these ideas. And we're not in World War II yet. World War II is going all out in Europe. This is actually the third of the Franklin Roosevelt documents in the exhibit, because it's so important even today. The other two are there particularly, I think, because of where we are today and Ukraine and the world. You could just change the names when he's talking about a dictator is never going to be satisfied by the present conquest. There's always more. Or, yes, America is strong, it's powerful, it's far away from the fighting, but they have weapons that are going to be able to reach us. And the war isn't going to stop there. It's coming to us. So we're always fighting this idea of, isolationism, and we'll be just fine on our own. But FDR points out that that's not how the world works. And so he, more than anybody else, saves capitalism by constraining capitalism, but saves it, saves democracy, and prepares us to get involved in the war that he knows is coming. And the only way that it wouldn't have come is if the Allies had lost before we were involved. So we have to actually be thankful to the Japanese for bombing us at Pearl Harbor, because if they didn't, and we had gone another 6 months or a year without entering the war in Europe, there might not have been a Europe to save. And then eventually it would have come here under very different circumstances. But the Four Freedoms is this picture of, here's this horrible war going on in the rest of the world, and here we are basically recovering from the Great Depression, on top of the world as any country could be at that moment. But he's saying, what are we doing? What's important in the world? What's important to people? And the Four Freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, fight back against power, freedom to worship God, freedom of religion, freedom from want. And this, I kind of skipped over it. I'm FDR, thank you, is making me think of another thing about the Constitution. So we celebrate the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution is our declaration of interdependence. And that's why right before we have the more or less United States. Are we going to be 13 separate independent states that somehow sort of work together when we can? Or are we going to actually be one nation, the United States? And interdependence, can you be free without having somebody else be free, without being in a society? Can you be free politically, but not be able to eat, to be starving, to not have housing or shelter? That's not real freedom, FDR is pointing out. We need a certain level of society and a certain standard of survival, of living, to actually be free. And that is what is under attack all across the world when he's giving this speech. And the fourth is freedom from fear and the armaments and all. The speech wasn't his most popular, didn't actually do much, because a lot of Americans are still trying to just ignore what's going on, keep our heads in the sand. But Norman Rockwell painted the Four Freedoms for the Saturday Evening Post. And that really helped popularize the speech. And so I'm really excited to be able to show what we think is the only known signed copy of the speech. So the FDR library has FDR's manuscript copy, but we have a signed one. One of his most important aides, Missy LeHand, was ill at that point, but was a collector and was very close to FDR, and so he sent her this copy of the speech signed afterwards, and the other speeches of his that we have in the exhibit all came from Missy LeHand. And we have that right next to evidence of a bad date that I had in New York. So after my divorce, I was on a date in Central Park, didn't go very well. I'm like, I'm not going back to the office now. I wonder if Sotheby's has anything on display. And I went over to Sotheby's in this sale that they hadn't sent me a notice of, and there on the wall is Norman Rockwell's final study for Freedom to Worship. And I immediately called my client who owns the FDR speech and said, we've got to put these two together. But this is the first place where we've been able to display the speech, those huge posters, and the study for Rockwell's for Freedom to Worship.
And we're glad you did. Yeah, we're glad you were able to bring those three together. The last is going to be a document that really goes along with the phrase, e pluribus unum. And can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I happen to think that that is America's secret sauce. You know, what does it translate to? E pluribus unum, out of many one. And that is on the motto, it's the motto on the Great Seal of the United States, which actually preceded the government under the Constitution. It's one of the few things Ben Franklin failed at politically. He was asked by Congress to design a Great Seal of the United States. Doesn't work. Two other congressional committees try. Their designs don't get approved. And then the task goes to Charles Thompson. Quick aside for July 4th party trick, how many people can list all of the signers of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th? Yeah, you're thinking, oh man, no. There are two. John Hancock and Charles Thompson were the only two people to sign the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. Remember that National Treasure document? That's done a month later. That's done for a souvenir. Even today, when an act of Congress passes, the congressmen don't sign it. The count is made, the clerk tallies it, and the president or the head of the legislative body certify it. So that's what makes it official. So it's that Charles Thompson, the only other guy on the Declaration of Independence, who's given the task, and he designs a motto for the Great Seal, E pluribus unum. Now it starts out of many one, really, that's probably referring just to the 13 states, but it also applies to the people. And again, the secret sauce of America is that people from all around the world have come here to work together. And there used to be the metaphor of the melting pot, which was a good metaphor, but imperfect, because that implies giving up so much of your original characteristics. So maybe a better metaphor might be a tapestry or a quilt. But metaphors notwithstanding, it's this idea that people all around the world are going to come with their skills, their background, their interests, and they're going to come here and become Americans and make this the country that it is and is always becoming.
I like your idea of it. And I like your idea of a tapestry there, because it seems like when things are woven together, they're a lot stronger and they're less likely to break. So I think you're really onto a thought process there.
Yeah, so that's the kind of thing where it's the book itself, it's this little manuscript. But then we have a copy of the seal next to it that came a bit later. Steve lent a couple medallions of the seal being used for the U.S., for the president of the U.S. that are there. But it's so much more than what it is on that paper. It's the idea that it represents and that we can continue to create. So going back to the founding documents, in order to form a more perfect union, this is a nation that's designed as a perpetual work in progress. And e pluribus unum is one of those manifestation ideas, to bigotry no sanction, to people coming together, all men are created equal, which is the greatest line of the Declaration, and in a way the worst line of the Declaration. If people realize, oh, what are these hypocrites, these slaveholding men talking about liberty? We should ignore them. And so my purpose in doing the Promise of Liberty and in finding MLK's speech as the bookend to that, the MLK who in 1963 had every reason to be angry at those founding fathers and the Declaration and the Constitution that one might say didn't include them. And MLK, like Frederick Douglass before him, is saying, no, these do include us. It's a promissory note. That's where we get the title, The Promise of Liberty, is MLK recognizing the Constitution and the Declaration as a promissory note that all Americans would ultimately fall heir to.
But some would say, if they go in and are, there's a bit of the story, if they go in and look at MLK's speech that's in there, the copy, they're going to go, the I have a dream speech does not have the words, I have a dream. Can you just remind us on how that happened?
Yeah. So what that is, first of all, original copy. It's a mimeograph, but it's as original as any. Even MLK himself didn't have the manuscript. He was speaking with one of these mimeograph copies that were printed between 3 a.m. and 7 a.m. on the morning of the march. And it's only a 3-page document because he's supposed to give a 5-minute speech. And because of John Lewis and controversy, everybody had to give their speeches in for vetting, although his was the only one that wasn't vetted. And he was also told, because he wasn't the biggest civil rights organization leader there, so he couldn't officially be given more time than anybody else. But all the other leaders said, yeah, 5-minute speech, but really go as long as you want. And if you watch the video of him speaking, he's looking down, he's reading, looks up, reads. And right before the last paragraph, Mahalia Jackson calls out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." She wasn't the only one. The whole night before, Jackson, it's not Andrew Dance, Jesse Jackson and other people are coming in and talking to him. He's at the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. And unlike his usual approach of getting a speech ready well in advance, for the March on Washington, he spent all his time working on the politics of it and getting people there, and then didn't actually start writing the speech until the night before. And it was almost an all-nighter. But at 3 a.m, he sends down the final edits. And we may have something very special to say about that later on in the course of the exhibit. But he sends down his final edits. It gets printed. It's this 3-page speech. He gets to right before the right before the last paragraph, Mahalia Jackson calls out, "Tell him about the dream," because she had heard him give a dream speech about a month before. And then he goes off script for 8.5 minutes or so. This is not there. And then he comes back and ends with the final paragraph that you'll recognize when you read it, and with the words, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. I think I figured out something about that just yesterday, because I've shown there must have been 1,000 or more copies made. There are fewer than 20 known to survive. And I've handled most of those. But it just was yesterday when I figured out, how is it that Mahalia Jackson called that out at the absolute perfect time, right before the last paragraph? Of course, she had a copy of the speech. Makes sense?
It makes sense, and sometimes it's about the timing and the right time to go off script. Well, Seth, we love having you in Peoria, and you have been such a great visitor the multiple times coming in, and we want to be able to have you back to Peoria. And this partnership that we have been able to build over the years with the Peoria Riverfront Museum has been very, very special. Our curatorial staff has really enjoyed getting the opportunity to work with you. The items that you've been bringing forward to us to be able to have access to, and also being able to share a vision of what we would like to do with these documents and the importance that they have in this anniversary. But as you're looking at the Peoria Riverfront Museum and our mission of being able to not only celebrate 250, but also educate, inspire, and to be able to make people feel that they too have a role and responsibility to the promise of liberty, which is really that promissory note that we all need to make for sure that gets paid. Any advice or thoughts about what we can do here at the Peoria Riverfront Museum or as a local community to be able to make for sure those things happen?
Yeah, well, locally, just tell your friends and get more people here. We are going to do a book for the Promise of Liberty that will be done before July 4th anyway. I'm doing satellite exhibits, which are helped greatly by the museum because now that it's curated, for instance, in New York, I'm partners with Sail Forth, bringing in tall ships from 30 countries. And we've got a museum venue, South Street Seaport Museum, that can only host 35 items. But now that we've done the whole curatorship, it's easy to pull 35 items. And because there are multiple originals, we don't have to take anything out of here to do that as well. And working on other satellite exhibits around the country. But one thing I love about this museum is that it's not being parochial about the exhibit. So many places are, you have to come in and see it, and that's it. And here, it's not up yet, but there will be probably next week 16 iPads added to the exhibit room with Bloomberg Connects so that the texts on the exhibit labels will be on. And my website, thepromiseofliberty.org, which we need to connect, has even more. Like, the text labels, you can have 150 words. But if we're quoting, the Lincoln Douglas debates or Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," we've picked phrases and excerpts from that we want people to be able to see, and that'll be on the website, thepromiseofliberty.org, or however we get to it, connect to it from here. And so we're kind of urging other places. I'm proud of the extent that we're able to showcase this exhibit and let people see what we've been talking about. But then hope that they copy it and that we copy it, because we're not done. So the Promise of Liberty, we can make a smaller traveling show for schools with replicas and all, knowing again that we still have the aura of the authenticity having been here. And so that can travel around. And the Promise of Liberty, we're not done with it after 2026. It's just as much relating to the Constitution, to the Bill of Rights, to MLK, as an ongoing thing. But the idea that we can talk about this as technology, not just as history, that we can play with it, that we can use it because it affects our lives. So this is a way to bring people together, acknowledging the problems, the shortcomings, the failures, but also talking about the great success that we've gained from this wonderful idea of liberty.
And I think you probably have some more converts in the room to the idea of the U.S. Constitution as a technology and as an operating system. So I think you're winning over some prospects there. And we here at the Peoria Riverfront Museum, we love to tell stories. And as we are ending this discussion today, and this is totally off script or things that we've talked about as well, but there is an important painting that you've told a story about, that you might have been looking for something else.
Yeah.
And things happened. Can we end on that story? Because I think that's also a very special piece as people make their way through the exhibition, not to overlook and to really be able to make for sure they take the time to really reflect on that.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you did that. Thank you. Yeah, Charles White, the painting is called The Contribution of the Negro to Democracy in America, painted in 1944. And this is the study of what became a very large mural at Hampton University. But how I got involved in it is, it was at Christie's. Coming up for sale, I talked to an art collector client of mine, described it to him, and he said, you know, no, it's not the great kind of particular kind of art that he collects. Turned it down. But then a couple weeks later, I was at Christie's bidding on the original Loitzy painting, Washington Crossing the Delaware. We all know the not quite this big, but the monumental painting at the Metropolitan Museum. But Loitzy also did a 6-foot version to create prints, so just as original and important. And that's the one, we didn't take it off the wall of the Met. That's the one that was at Christie's. So I was bidding for a client on that, got blown away. And I walk out, and the auction houses are constantly moving things based on the order of sales and all. And this was right in the hallway as I was decompressing from that auction. And I see it, and it immediately hits me that I hadn't seen it at all. Because I'm seeing it now, and I'm thinking, oh, wait, Washington Crossing the Delaware, that's 100+ years of the way history is being taught and being pictured. And Charles White is looking at that and saying, we're a part of the story too. So it's not burn it all down, throw it all out. It's we were in the story. It shows Crispus Attucks, who you can also see a picture of in the Paul Revere Boston Massacre print. Crispus Attucks is thought to be the first casualty of the Revolutionary War, and he's African American and Native American ancestry. It shows Frederick Douglass as the commanding figure in the picture in the center of Charles White. It shows Harriet Tubman. It shows the black soldiers who are welcomed into the Army by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and then by that huge recruiting broadside next to it. It shows Paul Robeson, people of George Washington Carver, people who have contributed to the country in science, in agriculture, in music, in arts, and with their lives in fighting for the country. And one of the things that, you know, maybe we could do later is start a competition for other paintings like that, the contribution of. And ultimately, if we get enough of those, I'll do my damnedest to borrow the Loitzy and bring that here and show, you know, all of the peoples that have gone into creating what really is this great country.
I love that idea. And what a perfect comment to end on. Seth, you're going to be in the galleries later on for anybody who would maybe have a question or be able to share a thought. But could we all give a round of applause for Seth Kaller today?
The only thing people can't ask me to do is give a 15-minute tour of the exhibition.
Thank you all very much for being here today. And please spend time, enjoy the exhibition. Make sure you tell your friends and family about it as well. And let's help celebrate what is to be the start of a very informative, fun year here at the Peoria Riverfront Museum celebrating 250 years.
Thank you, Sid.